There is something that happens in the narcissist's psychological system that almost never gets examined with the seriousness it deserves. Not the manipulation, not the cycling, not the devaluation or the discard, or any of the behavioral expressions that have been documented and discussed with considerable thoroughness in the clinical and popular literature on narcissistic personality. Something more specific than any of those. Something that occurs at a particular point in the deterioration of the dynamic, a point that is identifiable, that has a behavioral signature, and that triggers everything we are going to examine in this conversation. It is the moment the narcissist realizes the loss is real, not the moment the relationship ends. These are not the same moment, and confusing them is one of the most significant errors in the popular understanding of how narcissistic relationships actually conclude. The relationship can end formally, structurally, with all the external markers. The finality, while the narcissist's psychological system continues to operate as though the loss is temporary, as though the person who left is simply in a withdrawal phase that will eventually reverse, as though the emotional investment they walked away with is still, at some level, available for extraction. The narcissist system does not register the loss as real at the moment of structural ending. It registers it at the moment when the behavioral evidence becomes impossible to interpret as anything other than permanent. Gabor Mate, in his work on trauma and the architecture of the self, describes something that is directly relevant here. He observes that the most defended psychological systems are also, paradoxically, the least accurate in their reading of external reality. The narcissist's defense system, the elaborate construction of false self performed in vulnerability and strategic indifference, is not merely a social presentation, it is a cognitive filter. It processes incoming information through the lens of what the self needs to be true, rather than what is actually true. And what the narcissist system needs to be true, in the aftermath of a significant relationship ending, is that the loss is not permanent, that the person is still emotionally available, that the supply, though temporarily inaccessible, has not been genuinely withdrawn. This need distorts the reading of evidence for considerably longer than most people on the other side of the relationship realize. The person who has done the internal work, who has reclaimed their nervous system, rebuilt their internal authority, and arrived at the genuine indifference we have been examining throughout these conversations, may have been in that state for weeks or months before the narcissist system finally processes what the behavioral evidence has been communicating all along. Every unreturned message, every absence of emotional reactivity, every encounter in which the expected engagement simply did not materialize, all of this was being filtered through a system that needed it to mean something other than what it meant, until it cannot be filtered anymore, until the accumulation of evidence exceeds the defense system's capacity to reinterpret it, until something in the narcissist's psychological architecture is forced to register against every self-protective instinct it possesses, that the specific source of emotional regulation it had organized itself around, genuinely, structurally, permanently gone. And in that moment, that precise, identifiable moment of genuine recognition, something is activated in the narcissist system that their entire psychological architecture was built to prevent. Not grief in the integrated sense, not the healthy, painful, ultimately metabolizable grief of someone who has lost something real and is moving through the loss with full emotional presence. Something more urgent than that, more desperate, more behaviorally consequential. The recognition of loss, for a psychological system that was never equipped to process loss, does not produce mourning, it produces emergency. And what follows that emergency is what the rest of this conversation is going to examine with the precision it deserves. We established in the previous section that the moment the narcissist's psychological system genuinely registers the permanence of a loss it has been filtering as temporary is not a moment of grief in the integrated. It is a moment of emergency. An emergency in a psychological system organized around the continuous maintenance of external supply as the primary mechanism of self-regulation does not produce stillness or reflection, or the quiet internal reckoning that genuine loss eventually invites in a psychologically healthy person. It produces action, urgent, escalating, tactically varied action directed at a single operational objective, the restoration of access to the specific emotional resource the system has just registered as permanently unavailable. This is the hoovering escalation, and it is worth being extremely precise about what distinguishes it from the ordinary cycling hoovering that most people who have been in narcissistic relationships become familiar with over the course of the dynamic. The ordinary hoovering, the periodic reaching out that punctuates the narcissistic relationship cycle, the messages after periods of silence, the reappearances that follow. Episodes of withdrawal is a relatively routine supply maintenance behavior. It is the system checking in on a resource it expects to find available, reestablishing connection with something it has temporarily set aside, cycling back through the familiar sequence with the confidence of someone who has done it successfully before and has no reason to expect a different outcome this time. It is calibrated to the history of the relationship, to the pattern of withdrawal and return that the narcissist has established and the person on the other side has, until now, been responding to with the emotional engagement the system depends on. The hoovering that follows genuine recognition of permanent loss is categorically different. Gabor Mate would recognize it immediately as the behavior of a system in acute dysregulation, the behavioral expression of nervous system that has lost access to its primary regulatory resource and is mobilizing every available mechanism to restore it. The desperation beneath it is not performed. It is physiological. The intensity is not strategic. It is the direct behavioral output of a psychological system experiencing something that functions at the neurological level, remarkably like withdrawal. What makes this particular phase so dangerous for the person on the other side, the person who has done the internal work, who has arrived at genuine indifference, who has built the kind of internal architecture that holds without constant maintenance, is the precision of its targeting. The narcissist who has spent months or years in close relationship with someone has accumulated, through continuous and often unconscious observation, an extraordinarily detailed map of that person's psychological landscape, their specific attachment wounds, their particular hunger for acknowledgement, the precise emotional frequencies they respond to most powerfully, the specific words, gestures, and qualities of attention that have historically and most effective at producing the engagement the narcissist system requires. And in the escalated hoovering phase, all of this accumulated intelligence is deployed, not as a conscious strategy necessarily. The desperation beneath the behavior is too acute and too physiologically driven to be entirely strategic, but as the automatic output of a system that has been calibrated to this specific person over considerable time and now applies everything it knows in service of a single urgent. The approaches vary in ways that reveal this calibration. Where direct contact fails, indirect contact is attempted. Where appeals to the relationship fail, appeals to guilt are deployed. Where guilt fails, appeals to the shared history are constructed. Where those fail, the performance of crisis of a need so acute that only this specific person can address it is activated. Each approach is drawn from the map. Each is targeted at a specific point in the psychological landscape. The narcissist spent the entire relationship memorizing, and each, for a person whose recovery is insufficiently grounded, carries a genuine risk of producing the re-engagement it is designed to generate. The escalated hoovering is not evidence of love, though love may underlie it. It is not evidence of change, though change is what it will frequently claim. It is evidence of a system in crisis, deploying everything it has learned about a specific person against that person's most carefully rebuilt defenses. Knowing that it is coming is not sufficient protection, but it is where protection begins, when the escalated hoovering fails, when the varied, precisely targeted, urgently deployed attempts to re-establish emotional engagement are met with the consistent, unperformed, structurally grounded absence of response that characterizes someone who has genuinely done the internal work. The narcissist behavioral system moves to its next available response. And this transition is important to understand, not just as a tactical shift, but as a psychological event. Because what happens in the narcissist system, when the hoovering fails, is not simply a decision to try a different approach. It is a significant emotional experience that the behavioral shift is designed to manage. The experience of being genuinely, repeatedly, and increasingly undeniably refused by someone their system had organized itself around. And that experience in a psychology built on the foundational premise, the self is extraordinary, significant, and beyond ordinary rejection, is not processed neutrally. It is processed as an injury, and injured narcissistic systems do not grieve. They retaliate. Gabor Mate has written extensively about what happens when the wound beneath the narcissistic adaptation is activated, when the fragile, shame-saturated core self that the entire grandiose construction was built to protect is exposed to an experience it cannot metabolize through the usual defensive channels. He describes it as narcissistic injury, and the behavioral responses it generates are not random. They are the predictable output of a system, attempting to restore its sense of superiority and control through the fall. Only mechanism available when the preferred mechanism, the restoration of supply, has been definitively blocked. Character assassination is that mechanism, and it operates with a logic that, once understood, reveals more about the narcissist's psychological state than almost anything else they do in the entire aftermath sequence. Consider what the systematic destruction of someone's reputation actually accomplishes for the narcissist's internal psychological economy. It reconstructs the narrative of the relationship in a way that relocates the power. In the story, the character assassination tells to mutual friends, to social networks, to anyone whose perception of events the narcissist can reach. The person who refused them is not someone who did the internal work and arrived at genuine clarity. They are someone with serious character flaws, someone who was never who they appeared to be, someone whose apparent progress is actually pathology, whose boundaries are actually cruelty, whose indifference is actually evidence of a fundamental deficiency in their capacity for connection. The assassination takes the person's greatest strengths, the clarity, the groundedness, the genuine transformation that made the refusal possible, and reframes them as evidence of damage. This reframing serves a precise psychological function. It allows the narcissist system to process the rejection without fully registering its actual meaning. If the person who refused them is fundamentally flawed, then the refusal is not evidence of the narcissist's insufficiency. It is evidence of the other person's. The grandiose self-image, which the genuine recognition of loss had begun to destabilize, is partially restored. The injury is externalized. The shame that the rejection activated, that deep, foundational, pre-verbal shame that the entire narcissistic structure was built to keep at a safe distance from consciousness, is redirected outward and attached to the person whose refusal generated it. What makes this particularly important for the survivor to understand is the relationship between the intensity of the character assassination and the depth of the original emotional investment. The narcissist who felt little does not need to construct an elaborate alternate narrative. They simply move on. The elaborate, sustained, socially deployed character assassination, the kind that reaches across social networks and mutual connections and continues long after any practical purpose it might serve has expired, is the behavioral signature of someone processing a loss that their system genuinely cannot metabolize through ordinary means. The violence of the rewriting is proportional to the reality of what was written and what they are. Destroying, with such urgent and revealing thoroughness, is not your reputation. It is the version of events in which losing you means something about them. We've tracked the narcissist's behavioral sequence through 3 distinct phases now. The delayed recognition of genuine loss, the escalated hoovering that followed urgent, precisely targeted, varied in its tactical approach in ways that revealed the depth of the accumulated intelligence behind it, and the character assassination that surged when the hoovering failed, the systematic rewriting of the relationship's narrative driven not by strategic calculation, but by the psychological necessity of externalizing a shame the system cannot metabolize internally. Each of these has its own logic. Each is the predictable output of a specific psychological state encountering a specific obstacle. And each, for the person on the receiving end who has done sufficient internal work to observe, rather than be drawn back into the dynamic, is readable as information rather than experienced as threat. And then comes the 4th phase, and this one requires the most careful, most precise, most unflinching examination of everything we have covered so far. Because it is the most sophisticated thing the narcissist does in the entire aftermath sequence. It is the most psychologically dangerous for the person in recovery, and it is the one that most reliably undoes the work of people who have gotten furthest in rebuilding themselves. It is the performance of transformation, the sudden, apparently genuine, behaviorally specific emergence of everything that was missing throughout the entire relationship, the accountability, the self-reflection, the acknowledgement, sometimes detailed, sometimes devastatingly accurate, in its identification of exactly what was wrong and exactly how it caused harm that the person on the other side spent years hoping would arrive and had finally, through enormous internal work, accepted would never come. And now here it is, not vague, not general, specific, precise, delivered with a quality of apparent sincerity and emotional presence, that is, and this must be stated with complete honesty, genuinely difficult to distinguish from the real thing. Gabor Mate has spent decades working with people whose early experiences produced profound disconnections between their authentic emotional reality and their capacity to express it. He understands, with a clinical precision and a human compassion, that few people in this field possess simultaneously that genuine transformation, the real, embodied, neurologically registered kind that produces lasting behavioral change, has specific characteristics that distinguish it from its performance. It is slow. It is nonlinear. It is accompanied by discomfort rather than fluency. It involves the person sitting with what they have done in a way that does not resolve cleanly into a compelling narrative of growth and change. It is marked by the consistent behavioral evidence of a different internal state over time, not by the eloquent articulation of insight in a high-stakes moment, when articulation serves a specific purpose. The performance of transformation has none of these characteristics. What it has instead is timing and targeting. It arrives precisely when the character assassination has failed to produce re-engagement. It arrives precisely when the narcissist's behavioral intelligence that accumulated, somatically registered, profile of exactly what this specific person needs to hear identifies the one remaining approach that might reach through the defenses the person has built. And it delivers, with remarkable precision, the exact words, the exact acknowledgments, the exact quality of apparent emotional presence that the person's own healing journey has identified as what genuine accountability would look and sound like. This precision is not accidental. It is the output of the same neurological attunement system we have discussed throughout these conversations, the narcissist's extraordinary capacity for reading what another person needs. Now direct it not toward genuine provision of that need, but toward the performance of its provision, in service of supply restoration. The transformation narrative is built from the map of your healing. It speaks the language of your recovery, because it has been reading your recovery. It knows what genuine change would look like to you, because it has been observing what you have been moving toward. Genuine transformation produces a changed person behaving differently over time. The performance of transformation produces a compelling performance in the moment, followed, once re-engagement is achieved, by the eventual return of the behavioral patterns that made the relationship what it was. Not because the narcissist is simply evil, but because insight, however genuinely felt in the moment of its articulation, does not constitute the sustained, embodied, neurologically registered work that actual change requires. The most important thing to understand about the performance of transformation is not how to detect it. It is why it is so difficult to resist. And the reason it is so difficult to resist is not that the person in recovery is naive or insufficiently healed. It is that it speaks directly to the most human part of what they experienced. The part that loved what the narcissist could have been. The part that stayed because it kept believing that the person underneath the behavior was capable of becoming what the relationship briefly promised. That hope is not a weakness. It is the evidence of your depth. It is also in the specific context of the performance of transformation, the precise opening it was designed to find. There is a pattern that emerges with striking consistency once you understand the behavioral sequence we have been tracing throughout this conversation. Each phase, the hoovering escalation, the character assassination, the performance of transformation follows a specific internal logic. Each is the predictable output of a psychological system encountering a specific obstacle in its attempt to restore access to a regulatory resource it has lost. And each, when it fails to produce the re-engagement it was designed to generate, gives way to the next available behavioral response in the narcissist's repertoire. What we arrive at now is the phase that most people in recovery are least prepared for, not because it is more intense than what preceded it, but because it operates at a remove from the person themselves, through the social environment, through mutual connections, through the visible performance of a life being lived at high volume, in spaces the person cannot entirely avoid, in ways that make it simultaneously more difficult to identify clearly and more difficult to protect against without understanding precisely what it is designed to produce. It is the triangulation, escalation, and to understand it with the precision it requires, we need to begin not with the behavior itself, but with what the behavior is attempting to recreate. Gabor Mate, in his clinical work with people carrying complex relational trauma, returns consistently to a foundational observation about human psychological need. He observes that the need for significance, the need to matter, to be seen as important, to occupy a meaningful position in the emotional reality of people we are connected to, is not a vanity. It is a biological necessity, as fundamental to psychological survival as food and water are to physical survival. We are, at the level of our neurobiology, social creatures whose nervous systems require the experience of mattering to others as a basic condition of their stable functioning. And the narcissist, whose sense of significance is entirely externally sourced, who has no internal mechanism for generating the experience of mattering independent of other people's demonstrated attention and engagement, experiences the loss of someone who once provided that significance as a threat to psychological survival in the most literal, neurological sense. The triangulation escalation is the attempt to restore the experience of significance through the social environment when direct restoration has failed. It operates through the deployment of visibility, the conspicuous display of a life being lived fully, of new relationships being formed enthusiastically, of success and desirability, and social centrality in spaces, and through channels that are calculated to reach the person who has withdrawn their engagement. And it deploys this visibility not as general self-promotion, but with a specific and targeting intelligence. The new relationship that is displayed most prominently tends to mirror, in specific and identifiable ways, the qualities the narcissist knows the person in recovery values most. The social performances that are amplified through mutual connections tend to be calibrated to the specific emotional frequencies: jealousy, nostalgia, the fear of having made a mistake that the narcissist's accumulated knowledge of this particular person identifies as most likely to produce a response. What makes this phase particularly significant in the context of recovery is what it reveals about the narcissist's internal state beneath the performance of flourishing. Because a person who is genuinely thriving, genuinely moving forward, genuinely finding in new connections the regulation and the satisfaction that the previous relationship provided, does not need to perform their thriving at the volume and with the targeting precision the triangulation escalation requires. Performance at this intensity is not the behavior of someone who has what they are performing to have. It is the behavior of someone whose system is still organized around a specific person's response, still requiring, despite everything, the emotional engagement of the one person whose genuine withdrawal has left the supply architecture in a state of ongoing crisis. The triangulation escalation is, beneath its performance of abundance, a portrait of scarcity. Every carefully constructed display of the life the narcissist is performing to be living is organized, consciously or not, around the question of whether it will produce a reaction in the one person whose reaction would actually regulate something real in their system. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that becomes visible only from the vantage point of genuine recovery, is that this elaborate performance, deployed through the social environment with such precision and such sustained effort, requires more continuous investment of psychological energy than simply reaching out directly ever would. They are working that hard to appear as though they are not working at all, and the only person that performance is genuinely for is the one person they are. Simultaneously performing not to need, we have now traced 4 distinct behavioral phases in the narcissist's response to the genuine recognition of permanent loss. The escalated hoovering that followed the moment of recognition, urgent, precisely targeted, physiologically driven by the acute dysregulation of a system that had lost its primary regulatory resource. The character assassination that emerged when the hoovering failed, the systematic rewriting of the relationships, narrative-driven by the psychological necessity of externalizing a shame too acute to metabolize internally. The performance of transformation, the most sophisticated and most dangerous phase, deploying the accumulated intelligence of the entire relationship in service of a performance precisely calibrated to the specific emotional frequencies of the person's own healing journey. And the triangulation escalation, the deployment of social visibility and strategic display through the environmental channels that remain accessible when direct engagement has been definitively closed off. Each of these phases shares a common architecture. Each is organized around a single operational objective, the restoration of access to the specific emotional resource the narcissist system has registered as lost. Each deploys a different tactical approach in service of that objective, and each, when it fails, when the person in recovery maintains the psychological ground they have built with sufficient consistency, that the phase cannot gain the traction it was designed to gain, gives way to the next. But there is no phase after the triangulation escalation. There is no 5th tactic waiting in the repertoire. When every behavioral mechanism the narcissist system contains has been deployed and has failed, something happens that has no tactical expression. something that cannot be managed through behavior, because it is more fundamental than behavior, something that the performance of invulnerability was built at the deepest level of its construction to prevent from ever being visible. The narcissist collapses. Gabor Mate, in his clinical work with people whose early attachment experiences produce profound disconnections between their authentic emotional reality and their capacity to express or even acknowledge it, describes the collapse of the false self with a precision that is both clinical and deeply compassionate. He understands that the grandiose construction, the performed self-sufficiency, the displayed invulnerability, the continuous behavioral assertion of a self that needs nothing and no one, is not merely a social strategy. It is a survival mechanism. It is the psychological equivalent of scar tissue that formed over a wound so early, and so completely that the person inside it has no conscious memory of the wound's original exposure. And like all scar tissue, it is rigid precisely because it cannot flex. It holds its shape against ordinary pressure, because ordinary pressure is what it was designed to resist. But when the pressure exceeds what it was designed to resist, when every behavioral mechanism it can generate has been deployed, and has failed to restore the regulatory resource, the system depends on the rigidity, becomes catastrophic rather than protective. The collapse does not look the same in every narcissist. Its behavioral expression varies according to personality structure, available support systems, and the specific form the grandiose construction took in this particular person. But its underlying psychological reality is consistent across those variations. It is the experience of a self that was built from the outside in, constructed from external validation, maintained through continuous supply, structured around the reflected image of significance in other people's responses, encountering the sustained withdrawal of the specific external input that kept it viable. Without that input, the construction does not simply weaken. It loses its organizing principle. The self that existed as a function of your engagement with it has no stable form in the genuine absence of that engagement. What surfaces in that formlessness is what was always beneath it, the original wound, the foundational shame, the child who learned that their authentic self was insufficient and constructed an alternative self so completely that they eventually lost reliable access to both. The collapse is not the narcissist becoming available for genuine relationship. It is not the wound healing because the defense has finally failed. It is simply the wound becoming visible in the absence of the architecture that concealed it. And here is what makes this moment significant for the person who has done the work to observe it from genuine distance, rather than being pulled back in by it. The collapse, witnessed clearly, is the most complete confirmation available of everything the recovery has been building toward. It confirms that the invulnerability was always performed. It confirms that the indifference was always constructed. It confirms that the person on the other side of all of this, the one who did the work, who reclaimed their nervous system, who rebuilt their internal authority, who co-arrived at radical indifference through the sustained and unglamorous passage of genuine internal work, was never dealing with someone who did not need them. They were dealing with someone who could not survive losing them. And the collapse is the moment that truth, which the performance concealed for so long, finally becomes impossible to hide. There is something that needs to be said about the collapse before we move forward, because the collapse, as significant and as clarifying as it is for the person who has maintained sufficient psychological distance to observe it clearly, is not the end of the narcissist's story. It is not the moment of reckoning that the popular narrative around narcissistic abuse, with its implicit promise of eventual cosmic justice, of the perpetrator finally experiencing the full weight of what they perpetrated, tends to cast it as. The collapse is painful. It is real. It reveals, with an honesty that the entire preceding behavioral sequence carefully avoided, the wound beneath the construction. But it does not transform the person it reveals. And understanding what actually follows the collapse, what the narcissist does with the exposure of the wound, rather than what we might hope they do with it, is essential for anyone who might encounter the reinvented version of this person and need the clarity to recognize what they are seeing. Because the narcissist reinvents with a consistency and a completeness that is, once you understand the psychological mechanism driving it, entirely predictable. Gabor Mate has a framework for understanding this that is more precise and more compassionate than the punitive narrative the popular conversation tends to reach for. He distinguishes between two responses to the exposure of psychological wound. The first is integration, the slow, painful, nonlinear process of allowing the wound to be fully felt, fully acknowledged, and gradually metabolized into a more authentic and more functional relationship with the self and with others. This is the path of genuine healing. It requires sustained courage, significant support, and the willingness to remain with extreme discomfort for periods of time that have no guaranteed endpoint. It is rare in anyone. It is extraordinarily rare in someone whose entire psychological architecture was built specifically to prevent the wound from ever being felt directly. The second response is reconstruction, the rapid rebuilding of a new defensive structure over the wound that the collapse exposed a new version of the self that incorporates. The experience of the collapse into a narrative that preserves the grandiose self-image while providing fresh external scaffolding for the internal architecture that genuine integration would be required to rebuild from within. This is what the narcissist almost invariably does, not because they are choosing the lesser path with full awareness of the alternative, but because the genuine alternative requires a capacity for sustained emotional exposure that the narcissist's developmental history has left them profoundly unequipped to tolerate. The reinvention has a specific and identifiable structure. It begins with the construction of a new narrative about the relationship that ended, one that locates all pathology firmly in the person who left, that reframes the collapse as evidence of the other person's damage, rather than the narcissist's, and that integrates the entire experience into a story of the narcissist's resilience, growth, and eventual triumph over someone who was never worthy of them. This narrative is not constructed privately. It is deployed socially, with the same targeting intelligence that characterized the triangulation escalation in the spaces and through the channels where it will most effectively reach both the person who left and the broader social network whose perception of events remains an important supply source. The reinvention then moves to the construction of a new relational context, a new primary relationship that is idealized with the same intensity that characterized the beginning of the previous one, and that serves, as all narcissistic idealization serves, the dual function, providing immediate regulatory supply and demonstrating to the social environment that the narcissist is not diminished by what happened, but vindicated by it. The new relationship is frequently presented with a visibility and an enthusiasm that is calibrated to the audience of the previous relationship, structured, consciously or not, around the question of what it communicates to the person whose departure necessitated the reinvention in the first place. And beneath all of this, reconstruction beneath the new narrative, the new relationship, the new public-facing version of a self that has apparently integrated the loss and emerged stronger for it. The wound remains exactly as it was before the collapse, unprocessed, unmetabolized, waiting for the next relationship to be organized around it and the next person to pay the cost of its concealment. This is not said with cruelty. Bate would not say it with cruelty, and neither should we. The narcissist did not choose They did not choose the developmental conditions that made the defense necessary. They did not choose, in any conscious or meaningful sense, to become someone whose capacity for genuine intimacy was arrested before it had the opportunity to fully develop. The tragedy of the reinvention is not that it is malicious. It is that it is the best available option for someone who has never been given the conditions, the safety, the support, the sustained therapeutic relationship in which genuine integration becomes possible. The reinvented narcissist is not a recovered person. They are a reconstructed one. And the difference between those two things is the distance between a wound that has been healed and a wound that has simply been covered again, more carefully this time, with better materials, and with the specific knowledge drawn from the collapse of exactly how much pressure the previous construction was unable to withstand. We have arrived at the place this entire conversation has been moving toward. And before we enter it, I want to acknowledge something about the journey itself, because the ground we have covered from the delayed moment of recognition, through the escalating hoovering, and the character assassination, and the performance of transformation, and the triangulation escalation, through the collapse, and the reinvention has been asking something of you that goes beyond intellectual engagement. It has been asking you to see, with complete clarity and without the softening that makes difficult truths more comfortable but less useful, the full behavioral sequence of a psychological system responding to the loss of something it never learned to hold properly. And seeing that clearly, really seeing it, without the residual hope that distorts the picture, or the residual anger that simplifies it, requires a quality of psychological groundedness that is itself the product of the work we have been examining throughout all of these conversations. Which brings us finally to the only question that actually matters for the person sitting with this information. Not what does the narcissist do when they realize they have lost you. You know that now, with a precision that protects you in ways that general awareness never could. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge? How do you respond internally, behaviorally, in the quiet of your own processing, and in the external moments when the behavioral phases arrive? Apply their specific pressures to the specific vulnerabilities they were designed to find in a way that honors everything the internal work has built and protects it against everything the behavioral sequence is designed to dismantle. Gabor Mate, in the deepest layer of his clinical wisdom, offers something that I want to bring into this final section with the directness it deserves. He says that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is connection. And what he means by this, what the full weight of his decades of work with trauma and attachment and the ways human beings organize their lives around the management of unprocessed pain, is that the antidote to a dysregulated relationship with an external source of regulation is not the removal of that source alone. It is the development of genuine internal connection. Connection to the self, to authentic need, to the values and perceptions and felt sense of one's own reality that narcissistic abuse systematically dismantles, and that genuine recovery systematically rebuilds. This is what the knowledge in this conversation is for. Not as a tactical manual for navigating the narcissist's behavioral phases, though precision about those phases is genuinely protective, but as a framework for understanding what each phase is designed to find in you, and what the presence of genuine internal connection means for each phase's ability to find it. The escalated hoovering is designed to find the part of you that still needs something from them. Genuine internal connection means your needs are being met from sources that are sustainable, reciprocal, and not organized around someone whose capacity to meet them is structurally compromised. The character assassination is designed to find the part of you that still needs their version of events to be fair. Genuine internal connection means your sense of what happened is grounded in your own perception, your own experience, your own felt knowledge of reality, and does not require their narrative to be accurate in order to remain stable. The performance of transformation is designed to find the part of you that still loves what they could have been. Genuine internal connection means you can hold grief for that lost possibility without confusing it for evidence that the possibility has now arrived. The triangulation escalation is designed to find the part of you that still measures your worth against their display of having moved on. Genuine internal connection means your sense of your own value is generated internally and does not fluctuate in response to the performance of someone else's abundance. And the collapse and the reinvention, the final phases, the ones that reveal with such clarifying completeness, the wound beneath the construction, and the reconstruction that follows, are not designed to find anything in you at all. They are the behavioral expression of a system that has exhausted its supply of approaches and is now operating on its own. Internal momentum. Your only response to these phases, if you have done the work, is witnessing. Clear, grounded, uncompassionate, neither witnessing. Simply seeing what is there without being organized by what you see. That is what genuine recovery looks like in the face of this behavioral sequence. Not the absence of feeling, not the performance of indifference. The genuine, embodied, internally grounded experience of someone who has developed sufficient internal connection that the external sequence, however precisely targeted, however sophisticated in its deployment, however accurately calibrated to the specific vulnerabilities it spent months or years mapping, finds nothing in you that it was built to find. The narcissist's behavioral response to losing you is in its entirety a portrait of what they needed from you. Every phase reveals a different dimension of that need, and what you do with that portrait is the final and most important choice this entire journey has been building toward. You can use it to understand. You can use it to grieve what could never be, what it deserved to be. You can use it to recognize, with a completeness that nothing else could have provided, why the relationship was always going to cost more than it could ever return. But you do not use it to go back, because going back is not returning to a relationship. It is returning to a role. And you have spent everything you had becoming something that cannot be reduced to a role again. The narcissist lost you. What you are building now, on the other side of that loss, is the proof that losing you was the most significant thing they ever failed to understand the value of. Build it anyway. Build it completely. Build it in the full knowledge that it is yours alone. That has always been the point.